Another mass shooting, almost impossible to fully grasp from a distance, grabbed headlines this past week. It happened in a small church in a small town in Texas and cut short 26 lives that included several small children. And the news this tragedy swept from the headlines was all about a seemingly endless series of revelations about sexual harassment and abuse by men in positions of power and authority. Chillingly, an article drawing connections between these two phenomena appeared in the Huffington Post mere days before the Texas massacre, co-authored by three prominent women, each of whom we have had the privilege of featuring on this show. The piece is headlined, "We Need to Talk, the Link Between Sexual Violence and Gun Violence." The co-authors are Rabbi Sharon, Brous, a filmmaker and activist Valarie Kaur, and the Reverend Dr. Jacqueline Lewis, the latter of whom I am pleased to say is back with us for this week's show. Jacqui, it's great to talk with you again.
It's good to talk with you too, Welton. Thank you so much for wanting to talk about this important conversation.
If I'm reading this correctly, the article was originally published after the Las Vegas mass shooting, but before the Texas church attack. Have I got that right?
That's exactly right, yes.
Well, that really underscores even more how valid the connection you make in your article is, because we've learned the Texas shooter had a history of domestic violence and had at least been accused of sexual assault as well. Jacqui, please talk about why you chose to approach these issues in this particular way.
Yeah, thank you so much, Walter. I have to say, I'm just a little bit shaky this morning. Nicholas Kristof wrote a really important op-ed piece after the shooting happened in 2015 in Oregon, and just reminded us that every day 92 Americans lose their life to gun violence. And last night, I had a phone call from my cousin, Delinda. We grew up together. She's 50 and I'm 58, and she's like my little sister, to let me know that this morning she is burying her nephew, a 21-year-old boy. I'm calling him a boy, a 21-year-old young man named Chaz Bridges, who was shot to death, point blank, standing on a street in Florissant, Missouri, making a music video with his friends, holding a gun, maybe a prop, maybe a real gun. A man walked up to him and said, "Why do you have a gun?" Chaz said, "Because everyone has a gun." Because everyone has a gun, he said. Well done. And this man, this 35-year-old man, took out a semi-automatic pistol and shot my cousin's nephew point blank in the forehead and murdered him.
Gosh. Oh, I'm sorry. That's so close, and yet it is so familiar that those emotions we are experiencing. Tell me how you all decided to put these themes together.
Yeah, thank you so much. Because we're just, all three of us are sick of the thoughts and prayers conversations that happens after every one of these tragedies. Our thoughts and prayers are with you is what happens. And then the next thing becomes, oh, that person must be deranged or mentally ill. But in fact, there's a pattern here. That the fact is that the Las Vegas shooter was known to publicly shame and humiliate his girlfriend. The Sutherland Springs killer beat his wife and his step-toddler so badly that the baby had a concussion, a fractured skull. The Orlando Post Club shooter abused his ex-wife. The Virginia Tech shooter was known to harass female students before he shot and killed 32 people. And the Sandy Hook shooter murdered his mother before gunning down a kindergarten classroom of 20 kids and 6 adults. So many women in my life, often have experienced sexual harassment, sexual abuse, domestic violence, including women of faith. And so we're always having these conversations about how to protect women, how to protect girls, and the connection between that domestic violence and the gun violence has been so totally overlooked, so totally ignored, that we thought it was important to put those pieces together so that we can begin to understand the patterns and the systemic issues that lead to these mass shootings.
Mm-hmm. I'm not going to ask you to play a psychologist. I don't want to do that myself, but I do want you, because I know of your experience and I know of your insights, talk about what is it between these two ugly issues that cause what we're seeing in our nation.
I appreciate that, Welton, and I think you might know that I'm a psychologist of religion. I have a Ph.D. in psych and religion.
I didn't know that, but that's even better.
I'm not an expert, but I think we can connect the dots. Obviously, people who have been hurt people. I imagine if we track each of these individuals, we can go back into a family cycle of violence, right? An angry father or an angry grandfather. These patterns of power exerted over the vulnerable. And frankly, Welton, male power exerted over women in a culture like ours, to be blunt, that watches a public proclamation of sexual predatorness from Donald J. Trump. When we hear him talk about how he treated women in the beauty pageants and hear him talk about grabbing women's vaginas, and we elect that person, that says something about our culture blessing a kind of patriarchal, machismo, male domination, and violence in our culture that has made us turn a blind eye. So that shows up in the way we discipline our children. That shows up in the way we treat women in ministry. Some of us still can't speak in male pulpits. It shows up, Welton, in the way women are paid still no more than 84 cents on a dollar in terms of wages. The patriarchy and the violence on which our nation was founded still plagues us. And when we don't say no to it, and when we encounter women abused in their homes, if we don't say no to it, when women are basically have to defend themselves when they are accusing someone of rape, every one of those moments in time where we bless the violence helps us to turn a blind eye to the escalation that happens. The fact is that women who have been domestically violated are likely to be killed by their partners. Every 16 hours, a woman in America is fatally shot by her partner. Domestic violence victims are 5 times more likely to be killed if their abuser has access to a gun. And research shows that simply living in a state, Welton, with high gun ownership increases a woman's risk of being fatally shot. Isn't that shocking?
It does, and it makes me raise the question, is what you're talking about something that should actually be obvious to everybody, but perhaps for men specifically, it's less obvious because of privilege and experience?
I think that the reason we wrote the article is to extrovert the connection. I think men and women who are working with domestic violence cases, clergy, doctors, lawyers, know these stats, know this, but it is not a narrative, Welton, that's been put out there in the American public in a way that I think can increase our consciousness and cause us to take action. And that's what we want to have happen. You know, if we can name the connection between intimidation in the workplace, right? Like, think about an escalating. You know, you can be intimidated in the workplace, or you can be humiliated on the playground, or you can be harassed in a classroom or at a seminary. And then that culture promotes yelling, fisticuffs, shooting. It is an escalating cycle. And I think, I think perhaps we're not as aware as men with the power. And I think certainly people of faith don't own our power. And so part part of why we wrote this article as well is to encourage those of us who are people of faith, no matter what our faith, to be less intimidated by the NRA and other gun lobbies, to say, shout this down. We will stand up, in fact, for disarming our nation, and we will stand up for gun control, gun safety, and stop gun insanity.
Jacqui, I really appreciate you identifying hurt as the common factor in the lives of many of these men who have done mass killings. There has to be a man thing here somewhere, as uncomfortable as that makes me, because women who are abused don't go get guns and shoot the people that are abusing them. So why is it there in men and it's not so much there in women?
You know, that is a giant question. You should come see me at Middle Church and let's talk about it longer. But, Welton, I think it's true that we socialize boys and girls differently. You know, psychologically, how we become a person is both some combination of nurture and some combination of nature. I like to think that we become who we are in a narrative way, right? The stories that are told to us about us, the stories that shape us, and the stories that are true stories in American culture are we take the land from the Native Americans. We dominate them and take their land. We dominate and kidnap African people from their land and bring them here and make them chattel slaves. We beat down with guns and violence the people who used to be a part of Mexico and make them up and annex them into our nation. We become who we become as a nation in the bosom of violence and gun violence and predatory behaviors. So this is what it is, and those narratives then are shown in the movies and shown in the media, and those media people intimidate women and get away with it because there's a giant silence around that. So men's problems about being socialized to be violent, yes, that's huge. But all of us, male, female, all of us have to claim our voices and stop keeping secrets and turn on the truth. And here's the truth. The truth is we let men get away with violating women. We are silent. We elected a sexual predator to the highest office in our nation. And everywhere we see something broken, see something violent, and we don't say enough, we set the stage for Sandy Hook and Virginia Tech and Sutherland Springs. And we can't leave our conversation without saying it is a semi-automatic pistol that kills my cousin's nephew. And these assault rifles and these automatic weapons have no place in civic society. So we also have to collaborate with our colleagues at Newtown, at Everytown, for example, at Everytown, and say, let's make this gun problem go away. Let's disarm our nation so that our people will survive.
Jacqui, I know that you view even the darkest topics through a profoundly spiritual lens.
Yes.
So I want to ask you to do something. Would you take just a minute or two to address those who are most impacted by the violence that we've been talking about and speak directly to them? What message do they need to hear right now?
Oh, that's such a beautiful question. I was in a marriage, Welton, where my partner threw me against a wall. And, you know, I'm a good girl, I'm a Christian girl, and you're not supposed to get divorced. But I want to say to anyone who's been hurt, abused, sexually harassed, had their boundaries violated, you are beloved. Our Bible says you are awesomely and reverently made in the image of God. And the divine spark in you is gorgeous and beautiful and wonderful, and you do not deserve to be hurt. You do not deserve to have your boundaries crossed. You have a right to use your voice to say no, and that's enough. And so if you're experiencing something like that, tell someone you trust. Tell your pastor, your rabbi, your imam. Tell your spiritual director. Tell a best friend. And try to make a strategy to get yourself out of that space and that place. You deserve to have a life that is violence-free. And if you're listening and you know someone who's in a situation like that, please encourage them to report their circumstance. There are shelters, there are places, there are resources, there are websites to make sure that you know how to get out and how to get safe.
The Reverend Dr. Jacqueline Lewis is senior minister at Middle Collegiate Church in New York City and the host of Just Faith, a television program available on demand from MSNBC. Her Huffington Post article headlined, "We Need to Talk." The link between sexual violence and gun violence was co-authored by Rabbi Sharon Brous and activist Valarie Kaur, and we'll link to it from stateofbelief.com. Jacqui, it's been way too long since we last spoke. I so appreciate being with you today. You're always welcome on State of Belief Radio. Let's do it again soon.
Let's keep talking about healing our world with some revolutionary love.